I'm Carolyn.
I'm Ceri. Welcome to the Whisk.
What's a whisk?
The Whisk is our monthly exploration of what's in the news, and we are going to whisk some air into it.
Whisk some air, and we're using some of our nonviolent communication principles.
Yeah.
Kind of passing it through.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So we might get these whisks up to help us remind what we're doing here.
That's right, just in case we forget. So what are we looking at today?
So we are going to look at a conversation, an interview between Gabor Mate and Piers Morgan. And this stood out to me as an example of how to talk about a really challenging topic in a connecting way. It's quite a surprising interview.
And the topic is the Israel-Gaza war. And the interview is actually from November and we're in March, but it stood out so much it was really worth going back and having a look.
Yeah, and we're going to draw out some of the strategies that Gabor Mate uses to keep on topic, able to talk about what's true and real for him, but in a way that is maybe easier to hear.
All right, shall we have a look?
Let's have a look.
Okay.
Dr. Martin, thank you very much indeed for joining me, and thank you for your patience. I know you've been sitting there listening to the interview I just conducted with this poor woman whose parents were both kidnapped. One has been returned, one hasn't yet. First of all, what was your response to that interview?
On a human level, I saw a very decent person in evident pain, in grief, obviously deep anxiety about the fate of her father. I saw somebody trying to make the best out of a really horrific situation, and my heart goes out to her.
So what, we'll draw attention to sort of certain choices, actually, because we'll always have choices in conversations and interviews, choices that Gabor Mate is making. So in that instance, when Piers said, how did you respond to the first speaker? Gabor chooses to humanise, to empathise, to bring some acknowledgement to what the Israeli woman, I think it was, has been through. Instead of saying, there is another side to this. He doesn't do that. He goes to acknowledging the reality for this person and other people like this person.
Yeah, so it goes right into the heart and right into the, really acknowledging the horror of this situation instead of being defensive or argumentative or taking it to that factual level.
Yeah, and sort of saying there's another side to this. I think that's something that happens all the time is we don't allow enough space for acknowledgement of what is before we rush in to kind of give the other side.
So that's the empathic response. That's what you picked up?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, to take every opportunity to acknowledge pain and suffering, I think is really, really good move to make. Whether or not you agree with what the person is saying, but, to acknowledge that they are in a place of grief and suffering.
Yeah, okay, good. And I don't think it wasn't so clear, but this woman had some of her family members had been taken hostage.
I think so, yeah.
Hamas, yeah. So he was connecting on the human level first, and generally speaking, we could do that in any situation where there's a bit of heat or conflict.
Yeah.
Is to make that choice to connect and acknowledge and empathise.
Yeah. It stood out to me when he said, my heart goes out to her. It's like, I personally feel for you.
Yeah.
That really touched me.
Yeah. Okay.
You specialise throughout your career in trauma and helping people get through trauma. You've talked to many people who've been in extreme trauma. This is a very traumatic situation these last 2 months for people on both sides, for the people who were on the receiving end of this massacre on October the 7th, and we've just heard firsthand what that has been like for the people in Israel who suffered that, but also, of course, what's going on now in Gaza with many thousands of innocent people being killed with Israel's military response, including thousands of children. What is your overall assessment of where this war is now heading?
For that, you need some historical context. Now, look, I used to be a Zionist. As you mentioned, I'm a Holocaust survivor. Zionism was very important for me as a salvation of the Jewish people, until I found out that the state was founded based on the extirpation, the expulsion, and multiple massacres of the local population. And that's not historically controversial. So I'm taking a longer view of this. And I'm saying that the present situation cannot be understood without looking at the historical context, and nor can we move forward if the present occupation and the suppression of the Palestinians continue.
Yeah.
So the first question that Piers asked was, what's your assessment of where this is heading? And this is one of the things that Gabor was doing, was saying, well, for that you need historical context. So he chose to kind of look at history and also bring in his personal perspective about the change in his beliefs. He said, I used to be a Zionist until I found out about the massacres that had happened in order to take the land.
Yeah, so it's kind of like he's bringing his own personal experience and his own personal history, and also stating, a historical timeline.
Yeah.
What I also heard in there is he talked about a Zionist as a salvation of the Jewish people. So he acknowledged the needs behind the belief and the ideology that was driving at the time as well.
Yeah.
In the shadow of the Holocaust and that massive trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's personalizing. He's bringing his own experience as a Jewish person, as a Holocaust survivor, and sort of outlining the journey that the very complex journey of beliefs and the importance of what Israel represents for Jewish people.
Should we play a bit more?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've visited the occupied territories 3 times now. The first time back during the first Intifada, Piers, I cried every day for 2 weeks at what I saw.
So I just want to bring in this, again, another personal point of when he went to visit the occupied territories, he cried every day for 2-3 weeks when he was there. So bringing in this sort of personal sense of mourning about what is happening and really humanizing.
Yeah, and it's hard that does draw on Piers, who, his style, how would you describe Piers' style?
So, Piers, as you probably know, is quite polemical in his interviewing. He likes fanning the flames of what is being discussed and trying to find, maximum adversarial opportunities in it. And, he's visibly calmer in this interview. He's not on his sort of high horse kind of fanning the flames of division here. Yeah,
and I think Gabor is seeing in Piers a potential for crying for 2 weeks. Is a possibility that he is disarmed and that he has all of that going on inside him as well.
Yeah.
And so there's an invitation for Piers to step into his heart, actually.
Yeah.
Even though he's probably very skilled at staying in the game that he normally plays in interviews.
Yeah.
So he's I would say he does look quite disarmed to me in that moment.
Yeah. And another thing which I think kind of we're using the word disarm. I don't know if it's the best word, but anyway,
that's probably not.
Let's use it for now.
We've got to think about these words that we're using.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Words really matter.
Yeah.
But I think another thing that is having an impact, let's say, on the conversation is the fact that Gabor is using many different historical examples, including his own personal journey of how he used to be a Zionist and now changed. But he will come on to, in a moment, talking and drawing parallels between other historical contexts. Maybe we can listen to that.
Sure, let's do that.
This cannot go on. And I saw the news about the Elgin marbles being returned, and how you changed your mind about that. Well, how about returning the land that's been stolen from the Palestinians? I'm not talking about the state of Israel. I'm not talking about 1948. I'm talking about since 67 and what's going on right now. So there's got to be some stop to what's going on, and that's how I understand it. This is for the sake of both Israelis and Palestinians.
Yes, I completely agree with you. This is a never-ending cycle. I guess from the Israelis' point of view, what happened on October the 7th was on such a gigantically horrific scale. I do get a sense that Israel is in a collective sense of trauma, and that they are determined that Hamas should not be allowed to perpetrate such a massacre again. And they are on record, Hamas, just 2 weeks ago, their spokesman are saying they would do it again and again and again if they can. So that represents a clear existential threat to the security of people in Israel. So I guess my question for you is, what should Israel's response be? Everyone is increasingly concerned about what is going on in Gaza. Clearly, the loss of civilian life is on a catastrophic scale. Nobody thinks this is right, but at the same time, I think many would share my view that Israel has a right to defend itself. The question is, how do they do that appropriately, and how do they get rid of Hamas, if indeed you think they should get rid of Hamas?
Well, you're raising many questions and many fair questions.
So just want to pick up on his response, Gabor's response to that question. So where Piers is sort of asking, should Israel have a right to defend itself and get rid of Hamas? What is your response to that? And Gabor kind of takes some time, buys himself some time in a way by sort of saying, yeah, you're raising many questions and many fair questions. And they are fair questions. These are questions, if we were having an open debate, it's like we need to talk about all of these questions. So that sort of struck me of just kind of like slowing things down by acknowledging the validity of the question that is being asked, and in a way not kind of reacting to the fact that a question is being asked.
Yeah, or arguing the opposite straight off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it sort of settles everyone that, yeah, I am listening to you. We are having a we are having a conversation here.
Yeah. It's respectful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Bit more?
Yeah, a bit more.
Now, look, I live in Canada, where this country was founded on the suppression and the erasure of the indigenous population and the utter denial of their narrative. And in Canada, for example, there are horrendous residential schools where a few decades ago, if a native child spoke their tribal language, they'd have a pin stuck in their tongue. Now, most Canadians are not aware of that history. Most Israelis are not aware of the history of what the Palestinians have suffered. They don't know that in 1948 there were multiple massacres of large numbers of people by Israeli forces. They don't know the history, the subjective experience of the Palestinians.
So I think this is one of the really important themes in what Gabor is saying. So after sort of acknowledging the validity of the question, he then goes on to answer it. And this is another opportunity where he goes to a historical and other geographical context of going to, in fact, he's from Canada, and that Canada is based on the suppression of Indigenous peoples and erasure of Indigenous peoples. The main point that he's making is that many Canadians don't know about that history, just as many Israelis, he is saying, don't know about the history of the massacres against Arab people.
So he's bringing in the context and reminding us that for some reason we don't know, and this happens again and again and again. And so moving towards the idea that perhaps if we did all know what had happened, and if we could hear one another, that would be a way of moving forward.
Yeah.
And yet it hardly ever happens.
Yeah. I think his point is that this is deliberate. It's deliberate that we are not given full information about what's happened. The closer you are to a dominant mainstream culture, you are not going to know about what's happening to minorities or marginalized people. And he's drawing parallels with that happening in many different contexts around the world. I think there's something about the different historical contexts that Gabor brings in, which moves it around a little bit. So, and I can see that when I see that he's doing that, there's something about it that feels quite trauma informed, because when you are in a stress response, you get very fixated on something, and we've all been very fixated on this conflict, on this war, this however we describe it. We've all been very fixated on it. So taking a historical, longer view, drawing parallels with other situations, kind of helps us kind of take perspective, helps us take a breath. It helps me take a breath anyway. Almost like, when you're having a stress response, it's quite helpful to look out further than, you know, your screen, or, you know, just take a longer perspective. It sort of relaxes the eyes a little bit. I had a bit of that reaction to this when he was kind of moving around historical contexts and different geographies as well.
So it's almost like it's a natural way of de-escalating and maybe coming away from the fight that could be the first response or the ongoing response.
Yeah. And I think in a way, Gabor was kind of like one step ahead of Piers with this, because he moved around different contexts. So I think that disarmed Piers a little bit. That's my sense.
Okay. Should we look at a little bit more? Okay.
I understand the desire for defense and certainly even the desire for revenge, but that's in the absence of knowing what the Palestinian experience has been. And the Western press, and as in all countries where the local population has been displaced, the majority of the population doesn't know the history or the subjective experience. So if you're asking me how to move forward, let's inform ourselves of the actual experience of both sides, not just one side.
And so how did you find that?
Well, what he's asking for made total sense for me. End to the occupation, and to educate ourselves and hear from all sides that are impacted by this. And so maybe I just want to share a little bit about kind of something another video that I discovered after watching this, which was an Israeli person doing exactly what we are doing by going through this interview and saying all the reasons that he criticized it. And it's kind of like diametrically opposed for the things that we've been kind of appreciating. And that really made me think about, well, this is really resonating for me because it's kind of affirming my worldview.
Gabor's position.
Yeah, Gabor's position. And I'm sort of really excited that this is being aired and it's being received by Piers Morgan. So, you know, it made me sort of question, does this even really work if we are in very opposing worldviews? And, you know, I hope that it does, but it really made me sort of stop and check. So some of the things, and we can share the link of this video so you can see it, but some of the things that the Israeli person criticized was that Gabor was talking about himself a lot and what he described as playing the Jewish card. So kind of like saying, I'm Jewish, so you should listen to me. So he criticized this article for that. But also, maybe what really kind of stood out is that the Israeli kind of commentator said, well, Gabor is saying that that Jews have massacred the Arabs. And I'm saying that the Arabs have massacred the Jews. Who is right? And that is actually a really good question that he's asking when we are very sort of fixed in our wanting to determine what massacres have happened and how. We do get a bit stuck.
And I mean, it's that thing about hoping to resolve and move forward by finding out who did what and measuring, somehow trying to measure one massacre against another, and somehow that tendency doesn't help us move towards. It's not quite the same approach as, say, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we would be able to listen to what happened with compassion and with deep mourning and deep grief, and then work out where we want to go. How do we want to be together? How do we want to live our lives? It doesn't tend to, the who did what doesn't tend to easily lead there.
Well, I appreciate you naming the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it's like that's what's needed, something much bigger to hold a structure or a form that's big enough to hold all of the pain and suffering. Because when we're sort of stuck in this sort of tit for tat, talking about some person suffering, but then there's also this person suffering or this group suffering, we get really stuck. But we just need a wider form to hold everyone's suffering.
I do just want to quickly go back to the point that that the fellow who evaluated this interview from a different perspective, and his concern about the power of an individual talking about historical facts through their own personal stories and their own personal, really quite riveting change stories, and which Gabor does, and how powerful an individual can be. And we do tend to take stories in through people, and how it can also be very distorting as well, depending on who we're listening to. So I guess it sounds like by discovering this evaluation, it helped you ask questions as well about how you respond to, or we do, or anybody responds to a riveting, heartfelt, genuine, authentic story, and maybe also wanting to leave space and not take sides again, and try to hold back from just jumping in and taking sides.
Yeah, I mean it's classic sort of confirmation bias, isn't it? Where your bias and your worldview is being confirmed by, in this case, Gabor Mate.
Yeah.
Coming back to the interview and bringing in an NVC need as well, one of the main things that Gabor is talking about is the need for shared reality in understanding the histories of what has happened in the area.
Yeah. And of course, some of the other, triggers, people have been told that they don't understand their own history. That's a pretty tricky thing to take in, and I'm imagining it'd be hard to trust, and who is this person telling us how things are? And then issues come up in terms of, it's a very uncomfortable feeling, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm Australian, and I've been through, hearing a lot about the history that I wasn't taught at school, and it's very is it destabilizing? Yeah. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Similarly, from a British perspective, the things that have happened in the name of the English or the British, it's so much of it we don't find out about.
Yeah.
And so the need for shared reality, but also these needs for trust and maybe stability and maybe a sense of belonging. Wanting to stay in good relations with your national identity, and that story is not gonna help. And of course, this will be happening for people in relation to this conflict or any conflict. On all sides, there'll be versions of the truth.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that being confronted with the possibility that you might not know what's happened in your country and in your military and in your name is really destabilizing, very difficult to confront. And appreciating you here as an Australian perspective and also from British perspective, I that really resonates for me. It's very destabilizing when I'm confronted with the history of what's happened in this country in terms of genocidal forces or exploitation of people. It's really, really unsettling, and needs for positive self-regard. Needs for feeling good about where you're coming from, feeling good about yourself, and belonging.
Belonging. I mean, just the fact that as soon as you begin to start unearthing some of these things, from my own perspective, you've got friends and family and other people who don't want to hear it often, and that's risky and it's uncomfortable, and so there can be a loss of belonging and inclusion and other things, because of that. You're meeting that, it's like a cascade or a domino effect of, triggering other people's stability, and a lot of people do not like that.
Yeah. Especially as in this context of Israel, that need for stability has not been met for millennia.
Yeah.
So the fear of the loss of that.
Yeah.
In even debating the future of Israel and two-state solution is very destabilizing, and I really want to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
I really want to try and feel my way into what that must be like.
Yeah. And stay open to hearing more about.
Yeah. And I do just want to come back to kind of like appreciating the interview with Gabor Mate and Piers Morgan, and particularly about how I could see it in Gabor, that it was hard having this conversation. It was intense emotionally for him to sort of speak this truth, speak his truth, knowing that how resisted what he is saying as a Jewish person, how much that is resisted amongst Israelis and other Jewish people as well. So you could feel the tension in him about knowing what's going to come back at him because of the thing we've just talked about, the being destabilized and fears around belonging and safety. Yeah. It's possible. I trust that it's possible to speak truth and stay connected.
And stay connected. And that's a glimmer of hope that we're kind of holding on to here and wanting to sort of leave to ponder on that.
Yeah. Thanks for talking it through.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. We've whisked that one.
We've whisked that one as best we can.
As best we can, yeah. And there's more. There's always more.
Yeah, there's always more.